In a quiet town nestled in the heart of the city, a young black nurse named Clara began her first shift at a prestigious healthcare facility. She was excited but nervous, knowing that this was an important opportunity to prove herself. Clara had always dreamed of working in a high-end medical environment where her skills could shine. This particular assignment seemed special. She was to take care of a patient who had been in a coma for months. Her patient was none other than Maxwell Harrington, a wealthy, elderly billionaire who had made a name for himself in the business world. He had built an empire, gaining both admiration and envy from many people over the years. Clara had heard of him, of course. Who hadn't? Maxwell was a well-known figure in the media, his face often appearing in business magazines or news articles, mostly because of his high-profile deals and immense wealth. But the reality was that no one really knew much about the man behind the success. Clara entered the room, feeling a bit nervous but determined. Maxwell was lying in bed, connected to several machines that beeped and flashed as they kept track of his vital signs. His body seemed frail and fragile, as though life had drained from him during the long months of unconsciousness. He looked peaceful, almost as if he were simply sleeping. She stood by his side for a moment, taking in the sight. There was a sense of stillness in the room, but Clara knew that for her, the next few hours would be anything but still. The family had already set up a routine for Maxwell's care. Clara was to make sure he was comfortable, monitor his condition, and carry out various treatments. She noticed that the family had left a stack of notes and instructions, detailing everything from the medications he needed to the specific positions his body should be in to prevent sores. The family didn't appear to be very involved, which Clara thought was strange. They came and went, barely exchanging more than a few words with her as she tended to Maxwell. It seemed they were more concerned with his assets than his well-being, a fact Clara found odd, but didn't judge. Her first day passed by with routine tasks, checking his vitals, adjusting his pillows, and making sure he was hydrated. But the longer Clara stayed, the more she began to notice little things about Maxwell's life. His room was filled with pictures and awards, but they all seemed impersonal. There were no family portraits, no signs of affection from loved ones. Clara started to wonder what his life had truly been like. Who was this man who had everything yet seemed so alone? Despite her growing curiosity, Clara remained focused on the job at hand. She took extra care in making sure Maxwell's needs were met. Every day she spoke to him, hoping that somehow, someway, he could hear her. She wondered if he could sense her presence as she gently brushed his hair or adjusted his blanket. It was strange, but Clara felt a deep connection to the man, despite never having met him before. She found herself wondering what had led him to this point, where his own family seemed so distant, and why it appeared that no one truly knew him beyond his fortune. As Clara spent more time with Maxwell, she became more invested in his care. She couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility for someone who, though unconscious, seemed to have no one else who truly cared for him. It was the beginning of a relationship, one that would change both of their lives in ways Clara could never have predicted. Clara quickly realized that Maxwell Harrington's family was not like any other she had encountered in her nursing career. Each time they visited, it was as if they were following a strict routine, more like a business transaction than a visit to a loved one. They didn't seem to have any genuine affection for him, nor did they appear to care much about his recovery. The family came and went, sometimes staying for just a few minutes, sometimes not at all. There was always the feeling of cold formality in the air when they entered the room, as if they were more concerned with keeping up appearances than showing any real concern for the elderly billionaire. Clara couldn't help but notice the way they spoke to Maxwell, or rather, the way they didn't. They hardly ever called him by name, instead referring to him as the patient or father, depending on which family member it was. They didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that he was a person with feelings, hopes, and a life that had been lived long before he ended up in this vulnerable state. It was all about the money and the inheritance, Clara could tell. Every conversation, though brief, somehow circled back to his wealth, and who would inherit what after his passing. Clara was shocked. She had always known that wealth could change people, but she didn't realize just how deeply it could affect the way a family treated one another. There was a son, Robert, who seemed to be the most active in the family's affairs, though even he rarely showed any warmth toward his father. He was a tall man with sharp features, always dressed in a well-tailored suit. He had an air of arrogance about him, as if he already considered himself the heir to everything Maxwell had built. Then there was his daughter, Elizabeth, a woman in her late 30s with a polite smile, but an obvious coldness in her eyes. She rarely spoke to Maxwell, and when she did, it was as if she was speaking to a stranger. Clara could sense the tension between them, but she couldn't understand what had caused it. Maxwell's wife, Margaret, was equally distant. Clara rarely saw her in the room for more than a few minutes at a time. When she did come, her focus was always on his medical charts and the financial implications of his recovery. It was clear she was concerned, but it was more about the practicalities of the situation, how long he would remain in a coma, what the cost of his care would be, and who would pay for it. There was no sign of the deep love or devotion that Clara had hoped to see from a spouse. The atmosphere in the room was always filled with hushed voices and unspoken thoughts, as if the family was waiting for Maxwell's death rather than hoping for his recovery. Despite the coldness of his family, Clara continued to care for Maxwell with the same dedication she had on her first day. She took the time to speak to him as if he could hear her, adjusting his bed, making sure he was comfortable, and talking to him about things she thought might bring him comfort. Clara knew she couldn't change the family dynamic, but she believed she could at least bring a little humanity to his room. She wanted Maxwell to feel seen, even if his own family couldn't offer him that. As the days passed, Clara began to see small changes in Maxwell's condition. He was still unconscious, but there were subtle signs that his body was responding to the care she was providing. His breathing became more regular, and just once, she thought she saw his hand twitch ever so slightly. Clara felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps there was still a chance for him to recover, and maybe, just maybe, he would wake up to a world where someone truly cared for him, not for his wealth, but for the person he was. As the days turned into weeks, Clara's routine with Maxwell became a steady rhythm. Every morning, she would arrive early, make sure everything was in place, and check his vitals. It was all routine, yet there was a part of her that felt deeply connected to Maxwell's quiet presence. Even though he was still in a coma, his condition was slowly showing signs of improvement. Clara noticed the changes, subtle at first. His breathing had become more steady, and his skin tone seemed healthier, less pale than when she had first seen him. These small victories felt like triumphs, though she knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. Clara had always prided herself on being patient and compassionate, but as time passed, her interest in Maxwell's recovery grew. She no longer saw him just as a patient, but as a person, someone who had a life before this, someone with stories untold. It wasn't just about the medical procedures anymore. Clara began to find herself talking to him more, not just about his treatment, but about anything that came to mind. She told him about her day, about the little things she observed in the world outside, and even about her own family. She spoke as if he could hear her, hoping that in some way he was absorbing her words. Over time, Clara noticed that these conversations became more than just one-sided. Occasionally, Maxwell's fingers would twitch or his lips would shift ever so slightly. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to keep Clara hopeful. She would stay by his side for hours, hoping for any sign of real response. There was one moment in particular that stood out. One morning, as Clara was adjusting his pillow and speaking to him about the latest news, she noticed his eyes flutter slightly. It wasn't enough to be sure, but for a moment, Clara believed that Maxwell might be aware of her presence. She couldn't help but feel a rush of excitement. Could he hear her? Was he starting to wake up? The more Clara cared for Maxwell, the more she wondered about the kind of life he had lived before his coma. His room, filled with awards and photographs, offered no answers. There were no personal mementos, nothing that would hint at the man behind the success. His family rarely spoke about his past, and when they did, it was always in terms of his business achievements, never his personal life. Clara wondered if he had ever known real love or genuine connection, or if his entire life had been consumed by his wealth and work. She found herself wondering about his relationships, the people who mattered to him. Maxwell's family continued to come and go, but it was clear to Clara that their visits were more about appearances than anything else. They seemed to be preoccupied with the financial side of his recovery, asking questions about his medical expenses and the estate. Clara didn't let their coldness affect her. She knew she wasn't there for their approval. She was there for Maxwell, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility toward him. She was the one person who seemed to truly care about his well-being, and that sense of duty only grew stronger as the days went on. With each passing day, Clara's connection to Maxwell deepened. She began to feel as though she was the only one who truly understood him, even if he couldn't speak. Her dedication to his recovery became personal, and she started to dream of the day he would wake up, wondering if he would remember her, and whether he would know that someone had been there for him when no one else was. But as much as she wished for his recovery, she knew that she couldn't control when or if that would happen. All she could do was continue to be there, offering him care and compassion, hoping that one day Maxwell would awaken to the world around him. Clara had grown accustomed to the routine of caring for Maxwell, but one afternoon, as she was tidying up his room, something caught her eye. While dusting off the shelves, she noticed a drawer slightly ajar in the corner of the room. It wasn't unusual to see drawers left open, especially when staff or family members came in to drop off documents or personal items. But something about this drawer seemed different. Clara hesitated for a moment, but felt a strange curiosity pulling her in. She gently pulled open the drawer and found a collection of old papers and folders. At first glance, they seemed like just another stack of medical records or legal documents, nothing she hadn't seen before. But then, one particular folder caught her attention. It wasn't labeled like the others, and it seemed older, its edges worn and yellowed with age. Clara carefully opened it and began to skim through its contents. What she found left her stunned. The folder contained a series of letters, some handwritten, others typed, all related to Maxwell's financial dealings and personal affairs. But it wasn't just about his business ventures. As Clara flipped through the pages, she realized that there was something much more personal hidden in these letters, something Maxwell had clearly kept secret. There were references to a trust fund, not just for his family, but for someone else, someone Clara didn't recognize. The letters described a complicated web of agreements, with details about assets and properties she couldn't quite understand. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was dated several years ago and seemed to be a letter of intent. In it, Maxwell mentioned a secret legacy and the promise he had made to someone outside of his family. Clara couldn't believe what she was reading. Maxwell, the powerful billionaire everyone knew, had apparently been involved in something much deeper and more personal than his public persona let on. He had hidden this part of his life away, perhaps to keep it from the prying eyes of his family. But Clara couldn't help but wonder why. What had Maxwell been protecting all this time? As Clara continued reading, she uncovered more details. There were names, addresses, and even more mentions of this mysterious trust fund. But just as she was beginning to piece it all together, she heard footsteps approaching the room. Clara quickly stuffed the papers back into the drawer and closed it, her heart racing. She hadn't meant to snoop, but now she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just uncovered something huge, something that could change everything. The rest of the afternoon was a blur. Clara couldn't focus on her work as she kept replaying the letter in her mind. What was Maxwell's secret legacy? Who had he been involved with? And why had he kept it all hidden for so long? These questions swirled in her head as she continued to care for him, trying her best to appear as though nothing had changed. But deep down, Clara knew that she had just discovered the first clue to a mystery she hadn't expected to unravel. That night, she found it difficult to sleep. The weight of the discovery hung over her, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of responsibility. The trust fund, the letters, the secret life. It was all so unexpected. Maxwell's family had no idea what she had just uncovered, and Clara wasn't sure what to do with this newfound information. Should she confront them, or should she keep it to herself, not wanting to stir the pot any further? One thing was certain. The more she learned about Maxwell's life, the more she realized that there was so much more to this man than anyone had ever let on. And she was starting to wonder if, in caring for him, she might be uncovering the truth that had been hidden for so long. Clara couldn't stop thinking about what she had found in the drawer. The mysterious letters, the mention of a secret legacy, it all seemed so out of place. Maxwell, a powerful billionaire who everyone thought they knew, had a side to him that no one could have guessed. The more she thought about it, the more it nagged at her. She had uncovered something significant, but what exactly did it mean? And why had Maxwell kept it hidden for so long? She decided to go back the next day, unable to shake the feeling that she needed to know more. But this time, Clara wasn't sure whether to keep digging or just leave it alone. What if she was wrong? What if she was overthinking it all? After all, Maxwell had been in a coma for months, and these documents were clearly old. He might never wake up to explain them, and it wasn't her place to get involved in his private matters. But Clara couldn't ignore the connection she felt to him. She had taken care of him, spoken to him daily, and grown more invested in his recovery than anyone else in his life seemed to be. The more she cared for him, the more she wanted to understand him, his past, his secrets, and the people who had been a part of it. Later that afternoon, while Maxwell's family was out of the room, Clara found herself standing in front of the drawer again. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it once more, but this time she knew she couldn't walk away. She needed answers. She pulled out the folder with the mysterious letter and began to read again, carefully going through every word, every detail. This time, she focused on the names that were mentioned. Some were familiar, like the names of business associates and family friends, but there was one name that stood out: Catherine. She couldn't recall ever hearing that name before in the context of Maxwell's life, at least not from his family. Clara felt a strange chill run down her spine. The letters described Catherine as someone Maxwell had promised to protect, someone who had been important to him in a way that went beyond business. But who was she? And why had she been kept out of the picture for so long? The letters didn't provide enough information to give Clara a clear answer, but they were a starting point. It seemed like Maxwell had made a promise to Catherine, a promise that might have had something to do with the trust fund. Clara's curiosity intensified. She felt like she was on the brink of uncovering a part of Maxwell's life that no one else knew about, a hidden story that might explain why he had been so closed off to his family. But as Clara read on, another realization hit her. These letters weren't just business papers or forgotten legal documents. They were Maxwell's thoughts, his private conversations written down for someone who mattered to him. Someone who, from the sound of it, had been a significant part of his life. Clara's mind raced with questions. Could Catherine have been someone Maxwell had loved? If so, why hadn't his family known about her? And why had he gone to such lengths to keep her a secret? As the evening wore on, Clara found herself unable to put the papers away. She was so drawn to the mystery that it almost felt as if she couldn't leave it alone. She didn't want to betray Maxwell's trust, but the more she uncovered, the more she realized that these secrets weren't just his. They were tied to his entire family, to the people who had seemingly abandoned him in his time of need. Clara understood now that her role as his nurse was more than just administering medicine. She had unknowingly become part of his journey, a journey that involved hidden truths and unspoken promises. But even as she grew more determined to learn the full story, Clara couldn't shake the feeling of unease. If Maxwell's family found out what she was doing, there would likely be consequences. They were already cold toward her, and now she had uncovered something that could change everything. She needed to tread carefully, but at the same time, Clara couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she had stumbled upon something much bigger than just medical records and inheritance papers, something that could finally answer the questions that had been lingering in her mind since the first day she stepped into Maxwell's room. As the days passed, Clara found herself increasingly torn between doing what she felt was right and maintaining the distance that Maxwell's family seemed to expect. She knew she had uncovered something significant, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt trapped in a moral dilemma. The letters and documents she had discovered spoke of a life Maxwell had kept hidden, a promise to someone named Catherine, and a legacy that his family seemed completely unaware of. But what should she do with this information? Should she confront Maxwell's family, or should she keep what she had learned to herself, protecting the elderly man's privacy even if it meant keeping the truth buried? The nurse's empathy for Maxwell grew every day. She had always been compassionate in her work, but with him, it felt different. She found herself imagining the kind of life he might have lived, his rise to success, his struggles, the people he had loved and lost along the way. Even though he was unconscious, he seemed to have a presence that made Clara feel as though he was still with her in some way. She had come to think of him almost like family, though she had never known him before his coma. There was something about him, something unspoken, that made her want to understand him better. Maxwell's family, on the other hand, remained distant, never truly engaging with him. They seemed cold and uninterested in his recovery. Clara could feel the tension whenever they entered his room. It was always about the money, the inheritance, and what would happen if he didn't wake up. They would ask her about his health, but their questions were clinical, detached, and often followed by whispered conversations in the hallway about his estate. It was clear they weren't worried about losing him as a person, but rather as a source of wealth. Clara didn't know how to feel about that. It saddened her to see the lack of real love or concern from the people who should have been the closest to him. The more Clara thought about the secret she had uncovered, the more she felt a growing sense of responsibility. She had come to care deeply for Maxwell, and in a way, she felt like the only one who truly saw him for who he was. His family had abandoned him emotionally, and now she was the one who had the power to decide what came next. The question was whether she should tell them about the trust fund, about Catherine, or if she should let the past remain buried. Her instincts told her that Maxwell would want the truth to be known, but the consequences were heavy. His family was powerful, and if they found out she had been digging through his private matters, it could cause a rift between them. But if she stayed silent, would she be betraying Maxwell's trust? Clara thought back to the moment when she first came into Maxwell's life, when he was just another patient in a coma. Over time, however, he had become more than that to her. She had watched over him, cared for him, and even spoken to him as if he could hear her. In her heart, she felt that he deserved to be remembered for more than his wealth. He deserved to have his story told, the story of a man who had lived, loved, and kept secrets in order to protect those he cared for. But what would that mean for her? Could she really take the risk of telling the truth? Maxwell's condition remained steady, but Clara couldn't help but wonder if he would ever wake up to see the world again. She had held on to the hope that one day he might open his eyes and remember everything, the family, the business, and perhaps the promises he had made. But as the days stretched into weeks, Clara began to realize that she might be the only one who could uncover the truth about his life. The weight of that responsibility hung heavy on her heart, and with it came a deep sense of uncertainty. Should she confront Maxwell's family, share what she had learned, or keep the secret locked away, hoping that Maxwell's awakening might bring answers of its own? The more Clara thought about it, the more she understood that her role had become something much more than just a nurse. She had become a keeper of Maxwell's truth, and whether she liked it or not, she knew she would have to make a choice soon. Clara woke up feeling a sense of unease. The discovery she had made about Maxwell's life weighed heavily on her mind. The letters, the hidden trust fund, and the mysterious Catherine. Everything she had uncovered seemed to be pushing her toward a decision she wasn't ready to make. Should she confront Maxwell's family, Or should she keep quiet, respecting his privacy, even if it meant leaving his secrets buried? It was becoming harder to ignore the feeling that she had a responsibility to do something. She had spent weeks caring for Maxwell, learning more about his quiet strength and the vulnerability that lay hidden beneath his wealth and power. She had grown attached to him, not just as a patient, but as a person. The family, on the other hand, seemed to care only about the inheritance and what they could gain. They rarely visited, and when they did, it was clear they weren't there out of love or concern for Maxwell. To them, he was just a business deal, a figure whose worth was measured in dollars, not in memories or experiences. Clara was the only one who had shown him any real compassion. She spoke to him daily, hoping that somehow he could hear her and feel the warmth she offered. But as much as Clara tried to stay focused on her work, the secret she had uncovered kept resurfacing. The letters, the mention of Catherine, the promises made, it was all starting to make sense. Maxwell had lived a life full of love, loss, and untold stories. Yet his family was blind to it, only concerned with what they could inherit once he was gone. Clara found herself growing more and more conflicted. If she told them what she knew, would it change everything? Would they finally care about Maxwell as a person, rather than a source of wealth? Or would they continue down their cold, self-serving path, dismissing his past as nothing more than a footnote in their own lives? As the days passed, Clara made up her mind. She couldn't stay silent anymore. Maxwell deserved more than just medical care and distant family visits. He deserved to have his story told, and she was the only one who could do it. The next time Maxwell's family came to visit, Clara decided she would confront them. She would tell them what she had discovered, not to cause trouble, but to finally bring some truth to light. If Maxwell had trusted her with this secret, then perhaps it was her duty to make sure his legacy was honored, even if that meant facing the wrath of his family. When the day arrived, Clara's heart raced. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she couldn't back down now. The family arrived, as usual, with their cold smiles and businesslike demeanor. Robert, the son, was the first to speak, asking about Maxwell's condition. Clara hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She had to choose her words carefully. This wasn't just about medical updates. This was about something much bigger, something that could change the way they saw Maxwell, and perhaps even the way they saw themselves. "I found something," Clara began, her voice steady but firm. "Something that might change the way you view your father and the way you view his future." The room went silent. The family exchanged glances, sensing the shift in tone. Clara continued, telling them about the trust fund, the letters, and the promise Maxwell had made to Catherine. She explained that Maxwell had kept these things hidden, perhaps to protect them, or perhaps because he believed his family wouldn't understand. At first, the family was stunned. Robert's face reddened with anger, his expression hardening as Clara spoke. He interrupted her several times, trying to downplay what she was saying, insisting that it was nothing more than business paperwork. But Clara stood her ground. She told them they had to understand that Maxwell wasn't just a businessman. He was a person with emotions, relationships, and a history that went beyond his wealth. For a moment, there was silence in the room. No one spoke, and Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had expected this, expected them to resist, to deny the truth. But she also knew that it was necessary. Finally, Margaret, Maxwell's wife, spoke up, her voice cold and distant. "What's the point of this?" she asked. "What difference does it make? He's in a coma. He might never wake up. This is just another thing to deal with." Clara's heart sank. She had hoped for a different response. But deep down, she knew the family would never understand. They were so consumed by their own desires that they couldn't see beyond their need for control. But Clara didn't back down. She stood tall, determined to ensure Maxwell's truth was not forgotten. Even if the family wouldn't appreciate it, she would be the one to carry the weight of his legacy. She wasn't going to let his secrets die with him. As she left the room, Clara felt a sense of resolution. She had done what she believed was right, even if it didn't change anything immediately. Clara didn't expect an immediate change after her confrontation with Maxwell's family. She knew they wouldn't suddenly see him in a new light, and she didn't expect them to care about the past the way she did. But in that moment, as she left the room, there was a quiet sense of relief in her heart. The truth had been spoken, and Maxwell's story was no longer hidden behind closed doors. Even if the family didn't acknowledge it, Clara knew she had done the right thing. The following days were filled with a mixture of routine and uncertainty. Clara continued to care for Maxwell with the same dedication, but now there was a weight on her shoulders. The family didn't bring up what she had said, but she could feel the tension lingering in the air. Robert and Elizabeth still seemed preoccupied with their inheritance, and Margaret remained cold, her attention mostly focused on the financial side of Maxwell's recovery. Clara knew that they didn't care about the man who had spent his life building an empire. They cared only about what he could give them once he was gone. But Clara didn't let their indifference deter her. She continued her work, ensuring Maxwell's comfort, speaking to him as if he could hear her, hoping that one day he would wake up to a world where someone truly cared for him. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt. But Clara's commitment to him only grew stronger. She had become more than just his nurse. She had become the one person in his life who saw him for who he was, not for his wealth or status, but for the man he had been. One afternoon, after weeks of silence, something unexpected happened. Clara was sitting by Maxwell's bedside, gently adjusting his blankets when she noticed a slight movement. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but then it happened again, a subtle twitch of his finger. Clara's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? Could Maxwell be waking up? She quickly called for the doctor, her voice shaking with excitement and disbelief. The doctor arrived, and after a few quick tests, he confirmed what Clara had hoped for. Maxwell had regained some consciousness. He wasn't fully awake, but his brain activity had increased, and his body was responding to stimuli. Clara couldn't contain her joy. After all the uncertainty, all the waiting, Maxwell was finally showing signs of coming back to the world he had been absent from for so long. Over the next few days, Maxwell's condition improved steadily. He was still unable to speak, but his eyes began to open, and he responded to Clara's voice with small movements. Each time he stirred, Clara's heart swelled with hope. She had never given up on him, and now it seemed as if all her efforts, her care, and her belief in him were starting to pay off. It wasn't just his physical recovery that mattered to her. It was the connection they had built over the weeks. Clara had been the only one there for him when no one else cared. She had spoken to him, shared her life with him, and listened to the silence in the room as though it held secrets that only she could understand. Maxwell's family, however, remained distant. When they were informed of his progress, they appeared unfazed. Robert came in briefly, asking about his father's medical condition, but there was no sign of true concern in his voice. Elizabeth, too, seemed indifferent, more focused on her own life than on her father's recovery. Margaret, the only one who seemed to have a real interest in his well-being, was more concerned about the financial implications of his waking up. Clara couldn't help but feel a mixture of sadness and triumph. She had cared for Maxwell, not for any reward, but simply because she believed he deserved more than what his family had given him. She had seen beyond the surface and understood the man beneath the business mogul. Maxwell wasn't just a wealthy billionaire. He was a person who had loved, who had made mistakes, who had dreams and fears, just like anyone else. And now, as he slowly regained consciousness, Clara knew that he would need someone to help him navigate the next chapter of his life. He wouldn't have to do it alone, not anymore. In the quiet of the hospital room, with Maxwell's steady breathing filling the space, Clara finally allowed herself to hope for the future. She didn't know what it would hold for him, or for her, but she was determined to see it through. She had given him the truth, and now she would help him reclaim the life he had lost. Whatever secrets Maxwell had kept, whatever promises he had made, Clara would stand by him. He wasn't alone anymore. And that, she realized, was all that truly mattered.